Merci à tous d'être ici. C'est un vrai plaisir d'accueillir Andreas Elkjaer, who is I want to say, fantastic scholar. I'm very impressed, and I had the pleasure of meeting him this morning, and we had a great conversation. So I'm even more excited to hear what he has to say. Mas is a assistant professor at the University of Copenhagen, and he works on political economy, on political representation, on inequality. He's published in a bunch of really impressive journals, the APSR, World Politics, CPS, so really good stuff. The articles are not just published in good places, they are also good, the articles. I've read them and I've enjoyed them. What I really admire about his work, and I told him this morning, but it's really true. I think what's really amazing is that he's not afraid to tackle really big questions, and that is both refreshing and impressive and fun. So I really look forward to hearing what he has to say today. So please join me in clapping.
Yeah, thank you so much for the kind words, and thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very excited to be here. I've been looking forward for more than a year now, given that I had to cancel last minute, unfortunately, last year. So I'm very happy that we managed to find a time that worked for everyone. So again, thank you. So I'm going to present parts of my book project today, which is called Middle Class Democracy. It's very much work in progress, so I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on it afterwards. And yeah, I should also say, like, this is usually around my bedtime back in Denmark with a little baby that wakes up several times. So if anything is unclear or something, like, feel free to just let me know. Then we can take sort of like clarifying questions as we go, and then maybe save some of the more substantive discussions until later. Okay, so let's see here. Let me start by showing you a graph, which some of you might have seen something similar before. So this is based on data from Thomas Piketty and his co-authors, which is actually freely available now through this World Inequality database. And it shows you the share of national income going to the top 1% and the bottom 50% in the US and in Europe, and how that has evolved in the last 4 decades, right? And I should say this is pre-tax, so this is before tax and transfers kicking in, right? So what we can see is that in the US, we see a very dramatic increase in income inequality over the last 4 decades, right? So the top 1% used to capture about 11% of national income in 1980, and today they're capturing close to 20%, right? And we almost see the mirror image for the bottom 50%, where in the US, they used to capture about 20%, and now they're down to about 13%. So again, like a very dramatic rise in income inequality in the US over the last 4 decades. In Europe, we see a sort of like a similar tendency, right? But from very different levels, and also to a largely different degree, right? So income inequality has also been increasing in Europe, but again, like not to the same extent as it has in the US. And so it's sort of like become a stylized fact these days that governments haven't really done much to alleviate these rises in income inequality. So that's what I tried to show you here with some quotes from some prominent scholars. So in their newly published edited volume, Noam Lupo and Jonas Pontusson, they write that most governments in recent decades have either failed to reduce inequality or actively contributed to increasing it. And writing alone, Jonas Pontusson in his newly published World Politics piece says that democratically elected governments across liberal democracies have failed to compensate lower middle-income citizens, the majority of citizens, for pervasive and dramatic increase of top income shares, right? So the general argument here is that governments haven't really done much to sort of like represent the interests of the majority of citizens, which would be sort of like to compensate them for rising inequality in the ways that we would expect based on sort of standard theories of democracy. And here I'm thinking, of course, of Melissa Richards, which is sort of like the workhorse model of redistribution in advanced democracies. And so the question is why governments haven't done this, right? That's a big question that many scholars are grappling with. And we have a related literature here, which is based on public opinion evidence, which argues that the reason that governments haven't compensated lower middle classes for the rises in inequality is that affluent groups are exerting an outsized influence on public policies. So here I'm thinking about the work of Larry Bartels and Martin Gillis in the US and others in Europe. And here I'm just sort of showing you the main results from some of these studies in this literature. And so in the top row, you can see the results of 4 very influential studies of the US. And in the bottom row, you see the main results of studies of Europe. So here you have Bartels's book, Gillis in 2005, Gillis in 2012, and then Gillis and Page in 2014, right? And on the x-axis, you have the income percentile of the group. So where they're placed in the income distribution from the survey. So if you're further to the right, the group is more affluent, right? And on the y-axis, you have the regression coefficient from some regression that regresses a political outcome on these related policy preferences, which means that further up you go, the better represented is the group, right? So you see these upward going curves across these 4 subgraphs here in the US, suggesting that in the US, you know, the affluent see their preferences better implemented in policies compared to the poor, right? And this is then, you know, what it can help explain why we don't see these compensatory responses of governments. And in Europe here, I've included another study from Larry Bartels. This is actually a working paper, but still it covers like 30 democracies. This is a paper from Peters and Ensek covering 25 democracies. Many of them are European democracies. Here I have a study from Germany and the Netherlands, right? And you see very broadly very similar patterns, right? So even in these otherwise fairly egalitarian European countries, you see similar inequalities in political representation, again, like helping to explain why governments haven't really done anything about rising inequality. And so you have this dominating narrative now that I call winner-take-all domination. And that's based on this like growing concern about democracy and inequality, right? So specifically, the concern is that with rising economic inequality, the rich, they become more powerful because money buys you power, right? And they get more money, so they become more powerful. And then they use that influence to affect policies in their favor, causing more regressive tax and transfer reforms, which is further contributing to rising or to increasing inequality. And then you have this vicious cycle at play between economic inequality and political inequality. A related argument is that in the same period as inequality has risen, globalization has also expanded, which means that, well, some authors argue that it has increased the structural power of capital. So basically now governments, they sort of like become constrained in responding to inequality because if they increase taxes on businesses or on the rich too much, you know, businesses and high-income individuals, they'll just leave the country, and then that would decrease tax revenues. So governments can't really use the tax and transfer system to the same extent as they used to, right? So you have this argument that governments are either unable to actually do something about inequality, or they're unwilling because the rich are now so powerful that they're sort of like calling the shots, right? And so this is sort of like this argument that, you know, the democratic process has been subverted by the power of the rich. That's what I call sort of like the dominating narrative, for many of you are perhaps familiar with it in one form or another. So in the book, I present a competing interpretation of 21st century capitalist democracies. And I call it middle-class democracy because sort of like the main argument is that the middle class remains highly politically influential even in this age of rising inequality, right? And why is that? Well, I, of course, acknowledge that with rising inequality, some political inequalities may increase. It might also change the incentives of different groups to participate in politics. For example, like we know that from studies that in context of high levels of inequality, the poor tend to vote to a lower extent. And also, I, of course, acknowledge this, all of those findings, but I just think it's unlikely that sort of like those changes at the margin, they completely alter the politics of redistribution. So I think the middle class, and that's what I'm arguing, remains politically influential because it occupies a very favorable position in between the rich and the poor, meaning that the middle class most often will take part in the majority coalition that sort of like implements policies, right? So most often the middle class will have a say one way or another over which policies are implemented, how different responses are made. And so sort of like one implication of this argument is that the middle class have actually been compensated for rising inequality, and they therefore have been able to prosper even in this age of rising inequality, right? And this may even extend to people at the bottom of the income distribution. If middle-income individuals are concerned about bottom-end redistribution for purposes of social insurance. I'll come back to that in a second. And so a different argument I make in the book is that I think there's been sort of like an over-reliance on opinion surveys to study differences in political representation. And this is because basically from theorists, we know that political representation is the representation of both preferences as formulated by people and also their interests, right? So it's not enough to say like one person is represented just because what they say they want is also implemented. It at the same time needs to be sort of like a congruence between the policy that's implemented and the interest of the person, right? So that goes back to sort of like the very classical work of Hedda Pickett from the 1960s. And so, I mean, it's sort of like hard to do both in one paper, right? So I think this is where a book project can help sort of like shed some light on both at the same time. And so what I try to do in the book sort of like empirically is sort of like to triangulate the evidence, or like triangulate who gets represented using data from different sources. So I rely both on sort of like macro data on inequality and redistribution, relying mostly on like data from Piketty and his team. And then I use micro simulations, which I will also show you a bit from today, which allows us to estimate directly who benefits financially or materially from changes to policies. And then in the second part of the book, I sort of like reassess some of this public opinion evidence to see what, like, whose preferences are then heard in policymaking. Okay, I hope everything is clear so far. So part one is sort of like, again, let's sort of looking at macro trends in inequality and redistribution to sort of try to answer this question of whose interests are served. And based on these two like broad models of democracy, we can sort of have some more specific implications of what we would expect if one theory is correct and another one is not, right? So in this winner-take-all domination model, as I said, we would expect this vicious cycle between economic inequality and political inequality, where, you know, rising top income shares give more power in the hands of the rich, what they can use to alter or to affect redistributive policies in their favor, causing them to actually contribute increasingly less to redistribution over time, right? And at the same time, given that the rich, they call the shots, right, we shouldn't really see any compensation of the lower classes. That follows sort of like from this dominating narrative that I explained earlier. And sort of like one further implication of this model is that if it's really true that democracy has been subverted by the power of the rich, then the parties of the government shouldn't be so, it shouldn't matter much anymore, because like no matter which party is in government, you know, it's still like the same people who are calling the shots and deciding which policies are implemented, or all governments, regardless of partisan stripes, they are similarly constrained by, you know, globalization, that kind of stuff, to implement policy responses to rising inequality. And in this alternative framework, which I'm presenting, given that the middle class is still highly influential politically, we would expect them to be compensated for rising inequality, right? And we would expect that the rich are not really able to avoid contributing to the redistributive system because they don't call the shots, the middle class does. So we would expect them still to be the main net contributors to redistribution. In terms of the poor, as I mentioned, we might also expect to see some redistribution to the bottom because of middle class power. And I think a lot of that has to do with social insurance demand in the middle class. So for example, like in times of high uncertainty, where there is a greater risk of declining in the income distribution, of becoming poor, or of moving, downward mobility, basically, then middle class individuals would have an incentive also to support bottom-end redistribution in case of downward mobility, right? Another example is public goods spending, which is hard to sort of like target to specific groups. So think here of education, health, and that kind of stuff. That's also something that the middle class will support, and that will also benefit people at the bottom of the distribution. And again, sort of like this is sort of like, you know, a more like traditional way of interpreting democracy. And because of that, then you would also expect that the parties of government is still important today, with left-leaning governments implementing more progressive policies compared to right-leaning governments. Okay. So, so the first piece of evidence I would like to show you here is sort of like the evolution of how much people at the top are contributing to the tax and transfer system. So again, this is based on Piketty and their data. So if you have any issues with the data, you should take it up with Piketty and not me, right? I didn't really have an influence on these series. I'm just sort of implementing it. And here in Europe, when I say Europe, I'm referring to Western Europe, and it's a population weighted average of those Western European countries. And so so here redistribution refers to the difference in income when you move from pre-tax to post-tax, right? And it's expressed here as a share of national income. So what you can see here, -2, means that in Europe and the US, the top 1% contribute about 2% of national income to the redistributive system in the 1980s. And today in Europe, the top 1% is contributing about 3%, right? So they're contributing more than they used to. And in the US, you actually see that the contribution has increased to 4%, right? So again, this doesn't really fit with the story that the rich are able to skirt contributing to the system, because over time, they're actually contributing more of national income to the redistributive system than they did 4 decades ago. And here you don't really see a difference between the Europe and the US, because you see broadly similar trends in both places, right? But if you then look at redistribution to the lower and middle classes, you see quite different patterns in Europe and the US. And here I say redistribution to, because whereas the rich are net contributors to the system, the lower middle classes are net beneficiaries of the system. So they receive more through the tax and transfer system than they pay into the system, right? So you can see they're all positive numbers. So we can see in Europe that redistribution has increased both to the middle class and to the lower income class in the last 40 years or so, right? So in the middle class in Europe, in 1980, they received about 1.5% of national income through the tax and transfer system. And today they receive a little bit more than 2%. And for the bottom third, you see they received a little bit more than 4% in 1980, and today it's about 5%, right? So again, like in Europe, both the middle class and the low income class have actually been compensated for rising inequality during this period of time. In the US, you see a very different pattern, right? So the middle class, you can see like very stark increases in redistribution to the middle class, right? They also received about 1.5% of national income in 1980, and today they're receiving about almost 4%, right? But as opposed to in Europe, redistribution to the poor in the US have basically stagnated. So you see quite cyclical patterns, right? But if you just draw a long run average, you see it's basically a straight line, right? And so I think it's very striking that today in Europe, or at least just before COVID, right, actually more redistribution went to the middle class than it did to the poor, right? So maybe this thing about the poor not being compensated for rising inequality is mostly a US story, right? That's what these results would suggest, right? And so if you sort of combine these evidence from redistribution to the lower middle classes with redistribution from the rich, we can sort of get a sense of how much different groups have benefited or prospered in these two different contexts in the last 40 years. So to sort of like do that, I'm looking here at income growth with a base 100 in 1980, so we can see how well the incomes of people at the bottom and in the middle have kept up with the overall growth of the economy, right? So in Europe, the overall economy has expanded by about 70% in the last 40 years. And you can see that income growth in the bottom and in the middle have basically kept up pretty well with the overall expansion of the economy, right? So here, like all groups, broadly speaking, have benefited or prospered in the last 40 years. They're all better off than they were 40 years ago. In the US, you see a quite different pattern again, right? The overall growth of the economy, has expanded by about 80%, but there is a vast difference between the expansion of the economy and then income growth in the middle class, and especially at the bottom, where they're lagging far behind the overall growth of the economy, right? So again, it might suggest, that this dominating narrative that we have that's being sort of like applied in many different contexts, perhaps that's mostly a US, and perhaps that best explains the US case and not so much Europe. So sort of like if I should sum up, so the first piece of evidence I here present you, this is from one chapter of the book, right? What we've seen so far is like the top 1% are contributing as much, or actually perhaps more than they did 40 years ago. Redistribution to middle class increased in both the US and in Europe. In the bottom, we see quite different patterns in the two contexts. And we also see quite pronounced differences in post-tax income growth in Europe versus in the US, right? And so the US has received a lot of attention, and quite often, sort of like the US experience is sort of applied more or less directly to also explain what's happening in Europe. But maybe that's problematic given that the US experience might not be generalizable, right? I think there's an increasing acknowledgement that the US might be an outlier among advanced industrial society. So again, like it might be problematic to sort of like rely on these theories designed to explain US politics and to apply them directly to Europe.
I can interrupt.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks. It's just to have some clarification here. So does it include services, the value of services in this total redistribution?
It does, yeah.
Okay, good. So that's interesting. But then, although like you're still having some increase in inequality, as you showed in one of your first slides. So it's kind of normal that the rich contribute more because they are getting a bigger share of income. So
yes.
Yeah.
Can I answer that at the end of the talk?
Sure.
Because I have a slide for that.
Yeah, all right.
Which I actually took out, but it's at the end, yeah. Because what you show is like, well, I'll show that later on. Let's just remind you, right? Let's remind me. But yes, so like in terms of services, what you're asking about is like the value of in-kind benefits, such as like education, healthcare, and that kind of stuff. So in these data, that's included in post-tax income, but so basically that's the assumption, right, in this data. So that's probably not true. We don't have like super good evidence on the exact distributional consequences of in-kind benefits. So I think like what we can see in the argue is that like some would argue that have no redistributive effects. Some would argue that even like spending on education, you know, roads, defense, and so on has redistributive effects. And so by only accounting for healthcare as like having redistributive effects, we're somewhere in the middle. That's sort of like what they're saying, basically. But that's sort of like the assumption here, yeah. Did you have a question? Yeah.
Individual or household income?
So this is, they use what they call an equal split approach. So basically they take the income of household and they split it equally between the adult members of the household. So it's not equivalized. It's sort of like this equal split approach that they use in this. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, again, like, you know, looks a little bit different in the US and in Europe, and a lot of attention has been given to the US, less has been given to Europe. And so what I want to try to do next is to try to understand like what's going on in Europe, basically, given the large amount of attention to the US, it might be beneficial to try to study this other context. So what I will try to do is sort of like triangulate this evidence that we've seen from these macro data using a micro simulation model called Euromod, which allows us to directly estimate the distributional consequences of changes to policies. And so, so yeah, I think this is sort of like a new way of measuring representation, because like before we were relying on these general trends in inequality and redistribution, but of course they are also affected by structural economic changes, right? So they're affected by unemployment, the share of elderly, the share of students, share of immigrants, and so on, right? So that would also be affected in this series we saw, and we saw some cyclical changes, especially in the US, right? And so with micro simulations, what I can do is I can separate the effects of structural macroeconomic changes as, for example, the change in unemployment and their impact on people's income from the effects of policy changes, right? And so that's what I use this Euromod model for, which again, like enables us to directly assess like whose interest government policy represents, right? So I think that's different from using this more macro trends here, because we can directly assess sort of like who benefits from policy changes in this sense. And Euromod is EU's micro simulation model, which is a cross-national comparable model. It includes data from all the EU countries, including plus the UK. And there's data from the mid-2000s and until today. And it was originally designed and developed by a team of social scientists at the University of Essex. And today it's being maintained and developed further by a joint collaboration between the European Commission and Eurostat. And they have an office with a team that works exclusively on Euromod in their office in Seville. And so Euromod sort of captures the national tax and transfer policies in these countries in this period of time. And specifically what it captures is income taxes and social insurance contributions, and it captures non-contributory public pensions, social assistance, family housing, and income-related benefits. So it's most of these policies that are affecting people's disposable income. What's really missing here is the contributory benefits, right? So contributory public pensions and sick pay benefits. Unemployment benefits are captured partially by the model. But that's sort of like a limitation of the model, and it's due to the fact that in order to capture the sort of like the policy rules applying to contributory public pension, how that would affect different households' income, you would need to know basically the contribution history of different households, and that's not captured by these traditional household surveys. So it's just something that's not really possible to do with the data that's available at the moment. Oh, okay, so to sort of give you a sense of how this model works. So you're constructing two different scenarios, and then you're sort of like comparing the incomes of different households across these two scenarios. So the tax benefit system, all the rules in the tax benefit system relating to these policies that I just described are coded in Euromod. And so what you do is you take market income from a household, which is captured by these household surveys from EU Silk. So that's sort of like EU's main household income surveys. And so you feed that into the model, and what it spits out then is the disposable income of the household, basically, right? So you say a household with like this many kids with this income would be eligible for all of these benefits, they will pay these taxes, and then it computes disposable income, right? And so this disposable income that you observe here is basically equivalent to disposable income that you would directly observe in USILC, right? Because it captures these policies. And then you do a calculation in a hypothetical scenario. So you're using the same household income survey from the same year, which means that you're keeping constant the level of inequality, the level of unemployment, the share of elderly, the share of student, and all that. And then there's a little prime here, and that's because it's uprated to account for inflation. So the only way you change this is to account for inflation in the next year. And then you feed that into next year's policy system, right? And so you say like, okay, if what would this household receive if we feed it into the next year's system? And then what you get is then disposable income of these households if the only thing that changed during these 2 years is the policy rules, right? And so if you subtract one from the other, what you get is then the effect of changes to policies, right? And that's basically how the model works. And so in Euromod, this is expressed as changes to disposable income as a percentage of the group's disposable income.
So what are the inputs of this model? It's not just income. There's some demographics that go in there.
Mm-hmm. So basically, like it's based on these EU Silk surveys, and so they will capture like a lot of different information about the household, so their income, how many kids they have, because that's matter for like what benefits you receive, what type of income it is it capital income, is labor income, that kind of stuff, and you feed that into the model, and basically applies all these policy rules to this household, and then computes the disposable income. And so it's very detailed what they have there. So it's quite impressive work, and they keep doing that year after year. Okay, so so these are the countries in Western Europe that we have data for. Basically EU countries and the UK, right? And so here I average over all the years available in Euromod, right? And so on the y-axis you have here what I call policy-induced income growth. So the income growth to different deciles of the income distribution, 1 to 10, expressed as a percentage of the deciles disposable income, right? And so we can sort of use this to get a broad sort of like sense of who benefits from these policy changes during this period of time, right? And so this winner-take-all domination model would predict, again, if there's a vicious cycle between economic inequality and political equality, we might have expected to see some more regressive curves here, right? That's not actually what we see here. In most countries, we see quite progressive policy changes that are actually, all else equal, increasing the incomes of people at the bottom, right? And in some countries, we even see tax increases on the rich, right? In Luxembourg and in France, and in some of these Southern European countries, right? But at the same time, there's also some variation, right? So it's not in all countries it's equally progressive, right? You have like, Denmark is sort of like an odd case here because it has sort of a U-shaped curve. And that's basically explained by the fact that you have had some center-right governments that have implemented some very regressive changes to the tax system, especially one year where they lowered the top tax rate by 7%. That accounts for most of this regressive curve. And at the same time, the social democratic governments have implemented quite progressive changes. So then you get sort of like this U-shaped curve. In other countries like Germany, you see a fairly flat curve, right? So everybody has benefited more or less equally. But again, like the top decile is actually the decile that has contributed or has benefited the least from policy changes in this period, right? So again, like this sort of evidence would suggest that there's been more compensation than there's been regressive changes to the system.
So that's from 80 to 2020?
This is from mid-2000s. So basically for most of the countries, the series started in 2007, 6, 7. For some, it starts in 5 and some a little bit later. But it's basically between 5 and 7 and then until 2022 or 23.
Okay. And so the small changes there, is it because there's less growth, or because in Greece, everybody loses?
That's also, marked by austerity, right? And during this period of time.
Okay.
So like, yeah, that's so basically in Greece, it's marked by austerity, tax increases. So basically the policy changes have forced most of the population to actually pay more into the system than they did before, with the exception of people at the very bottom.
And so these countries that are able, like Denmark or even Sweden, that are able to achieve like a lot of increase for everyone, it's that, or it's because growth is growth?
This is the effects of policy changes.
It has to be debt.
Yeah, but I mean, if
it's driven by debt or driven by tax increases, this data wouldn't say anything about like how this financed, right?
No, but it cannot be tax increase, otherwise the rich would be negative.
Exactly, yeah.
So if you're all above, it means that.
Or growth.
No, because growth is not there. It's only policy.
Yeah. I mean, well, if you have like if your government gets more money because of growth, like you give the money to people, and then it shows positive.
Yeah, so it could reflect either tax cuts or more generous benefits, or a combination of the two.
Okay, and then it can be either funded by debt or growth,
or cuts to
non-transfer based policy.
Yeah, to public good spending. Yeah. So again, like I see it sort of like as a way of trying to triangulate the evidence, because this gets closer to who actually benefits from policy changes rather than just looking at overall trends, right? And so what we might want to do next is to see like, okay, so when are policy changes progressive or regressive, right? And so first what I do here is just to break down sort of these policy-induced income curves by the level of inequality. So here I look at low inequality context, which is the 10% of country years with the lowest level of inequality pre-tax, and high inequality context, which are the country years, the 10% country years with the highest levels of inequality, right? And so again, like if you would expect from this vicious cycle, you would expect to see regressive curves in high inequality context, but actually you do see progressive curves, right? So in low inequality context, the policy-induced income growth curve here is fairly flat, so it's like it doesn't really have much redistributive effects, right? But in high inequality context, you see sort of like this progressive curve, where especially people in the bottom 40% or so are benefiting the most, and perhaps at the top you might even see a slight tax increases when inequality is high. Right, again, so this would be more consistent with this idea of compensation than, winner-take-all domination in these European countries. And you see a similar pattern if you look at risk of poverty. So again, like when risk of poverty is very low, basically there's a flat curve. And when risk of poverty is very high, you see a very progressive curve, which is highly targeted to the two bottom income deciles. So this might suggest that when uncertainty is high, when risk of poverty is high, there is a majority coalition between the lower income class and the middle classes in favor of more progressive or more generous policies at the bottom for the middle class as an insurance against falling down in income distribution. And obviously, the poor will always be interested in increasing benefits to their own group, right? And so we also see quite strong evidence that partisanship still matters. So the blue line here is when right parties are in government, and the red line is here when left parties are in government. So you see again fairly flat for right-wing parties, right-wing governments, and quite progressive curve for left-wing parties. Again, like might even see slight tax increases on the rich when left parties are in government. Yeah. So again, like if you sum this up, like in Europe in this period of time, you don't see much evidence of winner-take-all domination. You see some evidence of compensation, right? The government's actually trying to make up for rising market inequality through more progressive tax and transit policies, at least partly, right? They might not fully make up for it. Even in Denmark, you know, like I would say, you wouldn't expect to see the same patterns in Denmark and the US, but some others might argue, well, inequality has also increased in Denmark in the last 40 years. So, you know, like maybe, you know, maybe it's not a good benchmark, right? Maybe we would actually expect the same thing, expect to see the same thing here. So sort of like as a placebo test, I might be pushing it a little bit here. But then I try to examine, so like, what does it look like in Sweden and Norway between 1960 and 1980? So basically, this was the period where these countries developed the most generous welfare states in the history of the world, right? It's before the neoliberal turn of the 1980s. It's before inequality started rising. It's the expansionary phase of the welfare state that's characterized by strong labor unions and strong social democratic parties, right? So I would argue that you wouldn't really expect the rich to be dominating in this period of time in these countries. So if they do, it might suggest that the tools, the approach we're using to capture inequalities in representation might not accurately capture differences in representation. That's my claim. And so what do we see here? Here I'm relying on data from Ruben Mathisen and Jonas Pontussen and others that are pooling data from Norway and Sweden. And they have 200 observations, so 200 issues in these countries in this period of time, right? And so what you find is that when you're regressing changes in policies on support for changes in policies in these three income groups, you basically find very, very similar pattern as Martin Giddens did in the US and Larry Bartels did in the US, right? So across countries today, you see very, very similar patterns, and it even extends back to the golden age of the welfare state in these Nordic countries, right?
Can you say something about the types of issues here? They're not just economic, right?
Not these ones. It's a mix. Yeah, I haven't looked closely into which exact issues it is, but it is a mix here. Yeah, but there are fixed effects for type of issue and for years in these regressions here. But yes, it's both economic and non-economic issues included in this regression here. But still, like, I think still, like, I mean, you still have strong social democratic parties and strong labor unions. So I don't know. I mean, if that matters for politics, I think that should also probably also matter for non-economic issues. Anyway, so let me move on so we can, so I don't waste too much time on. So we'll finish the presentation. So anyway, I think this suggests, you know, the lack of contextual variation suggests that there is a generic driver that might be driving these results across context, across years, across countries, across periods, right? And so what could that be? Like, I think like that would help us sort of like to rule out some of the potential explanations like money in politics, organization of labor, all that kind of stuff. And so like one thing that I'm highlighting here and what I think might help us explain and understand these findings is information asymmetries. So basically the fact that some people are better informed about politics than others. And we know that that correlates with socioeconomic status, and we know that these information asymmetries are omnipresent. They are present everywhere, right? And so perhaps that can help us explain these differences you see in policy responsiveness. And so that's basically what I do a lot more in the second part of the book, but that's sort of like the key argument that I'm trying to make in the book. And then I'm also trying to analyze sort of like the congruence between people's levels, preferences, and then the spending levels and tax rates in this book. But I'll only show you like the evidence for this kind of like information asymmetry in this talk. And so here I'm looking at social spending. In another chapter, I'm looking at taxes. And basically the argument is that that these policies respond more strongly to preferences of the affluent because the affluent are better informed about the context in which they live compared to the lower income classes. And specifically, I look here at spending and on government debt, which means that I'm arguing basically that the rich have stronger thermostatic responses to changing in spending compared to the lower income classes, which will be because like the rich stay better, because they're better informed, they notice when spending changes and therefore they adjust their preferences accordingly. Whereas lower income groups, they're not as informed. Not as many people in these lower socioeconomic groups, they notice when spending changes and therefore they don't adjust their spending as much. And that makes representation less meaningful. So that basically follows the work of Stuart Soroka and Chris Valation. And the argument in terms of government debt is that because more affluent people are better informed, they better understand the constraints that governments are acting under. And therefore, when debt is high, they sort of understand, okay, we can't just keep increasing spending. So therefore, they'll be more reluctant to support more spending there compared to the lower income classes, right? And so how should we test this argument? So the first step, of course, would be to show that the affluent are better informed about politics and the economy. This has been showed multiple times across studies. I also have data for it. I won't show it here. The second implication would be, well, the affluent, then they should respond more strongly to spending and debt, right? Because they're better informed, they adjust more strongly to these factors. And then spending should respond more strongly to the preference of the affluent because of that, right? Meaning that when we try to account for these differences in responses to spending and debt, basically this unequal responsiveness should disappear, right? So that's sort of like what I will try to show you today. And so in terms of data, I use data from ISSP and CSES on preferences for changes in spending on health, pensions, unemployment, education, create an index there. The dependent variable is social spending as a percentage of GDP, so changes in spending here. And I have data for 20 advanced democracies in this period since mid-1980s. And using the same methodology as Gillen's, I then predict the preferences of people at the 10th percentile, 50th percentile, 90th percentile, reflecting the poor, the middle class, and the affluent. And so the first step is to examine how the preference of these groups respond to changes in spending and in debt. So the first one here, spending, would be the thermostatic response of these different groups to changes in spending. And we can see the thermostatic response of the affluent is stronger than the thermostatic responses of the low and middle income classes, which is consistent with my argument, right? In terms of government debt, you also see stronger responses among the affluent, suggesting that they might better understand these constraints that governments are acting under when debt is high. And so based on these findings, we would then expect to see differentials in policy responsiveness when we're regressing changes in spending on preferences for change, right? And that is what we see. So we look at the bivariate models, you see, stronger coefficient for the affluent than for the lower income classes. You also see, if you look at the model fit, you can also see it's increasing with income. And if you try to put all of them into the same model, you basically see this very familiar finding that only the preference of the affluent seems to influence changes in spending, right? So this would also be consistent with my argument. But of course, it's also consistent with money in politics, right? That the rich are more influential and that these results reflect actual disparities in substantive political representation. So what we need to do is we need to sort of like pass out the effect of information from the effect of all these other factors that might explain the findings. So basically what I try to do is to adjust for these differential responses to spending and debt. And so like the intuition here is that I set the responses of the low and middle income groups to spending and debt equal to the responses of the high income group. And otherwise I keep everything as is. So, technically, these two lines here are true by definition, right? So the preferences of the high income group is equal to the country intercept from countries and decades. And then how they respond to spending, how they respond to debt, plus the error term, right? And the same for the low income group here. And so what I do is when I try to adjust for spending here, or the preference of the low income group, I use, again, like their preferences. I just adjust for the fact that they respond less strongly to spending and debt compared to the high income group, right? So the only thing I'm doing is just changing this from being 0.007 to 0.021, and same for debt, right? So that's the only thing I'm tweaking here. And given that I'm only adjusting for how they respond to spending and debt, it's minor adjustments I'm making. So here you see the correlation between the actual preferences and the adjusted preferences. As you can see, they're almost perfectly correlated. So we are really talking about minor adjustments, which is also visible from these box plots, from actual and adjusted preferences of the low income group, middle income group, and here just had the high income group as a base comparison, right? So again, minor adjustments I'm making. I'm not doing a whole lot, I'm just changing the series a little bit so they respond more strongly over time to these changes in the economy. So next, what I do is I use the adjusted preferences of these income groups in the regression together with the preference of the high income group. And what do you see? It basically explains the differences, right? So the coefficients now are higher for the low and middle income groups compared to the high income group. The model fit is basically the same across all models. If you put them all into the same model, you get positive coefficients for all of them. None of them are statistically significant individually. There's a lot of multicollinearity in these models, right? Because these preferences are highly correlated. And the preference of all these groups are jointly significant if you do like a joint F-test. So I think this is probably the closest we can get to equal representation in sort of like this context of highly correlated preferences. Okay. So I'll try to conclude now, broadly speaking, on this different kind of evidence I've shown you. So basically, like, I think so, like, one implication of this project is that, so like, the majority of people or groups have prospered in the last 4 decades, and that's partly a result of active government actions, right? And so I think that sort of like forces us to reconsider this stylized fact that governments have not compensated lower and middle income, lower and middle classes for rising inequality. At least that might be, while that might be true to some extent in the US, it doesn't seem to be the case in most European countries. And again, like I'm acknowledging that, you know, sure, economic and political inequalities are interrelated. I'm not doubting that. But here, I don't think this evidence suggests that there's a vicious cycle at play, at least not in Europe. And then I think like a last implication here is that we need to be very careful when we are trying to estimate inequalities in political representation based on subgroup estimates of public opinion, right? I think we need to take a broader array of evidence into account before we make substantive conclusions about who gets represented and who doesn't, right? And at the same time, so that's sort of like more positive implications here. Then I still want to sort of like include one that's a little bit more skeptical, pessimistic, and that is that what I've shown you is sort of like aggregate level data, right? And that masks significant individual level variation, right? So in this period of time, many people near the bottom have experienced job losses, right? They have experienced increased uncertainty, downward mobility, or a perceived loss of status. And we know that that's fueling discontent and a feeling that the government is not responsive and populism, right? So while it is true, at least according to this data, that all groups, broadly speaking, have prospered at the individual level or household level, I mean, things might be slightly different, right? Which can help us explain why, even in a context where all groups have, you know, are better off today than 4 decades ago, there's still a lot of discontent and unhappiness. I'll end.